All right. So now I'd like to introduce our third speaker tonight. Elize St. Charles received her Ph.D. in Natural Health and Healing from the Clayton College of Natural Health and has been involved in alternative and complementary healing modalities for more than 30 years. With her extensive understanding of the natural healing arts, Elize has provided healthcare to people in all walks of life, including star athletes, executives, mothers, babies, the brain injured, and the chronically ill. Her extensive academic and professional development and problem-solving skills combined with her success in improving her own health uniquely qualify her to address a wide variety of health concerns. Elize is the mother of 3 healthy young adults and lives in Silicon Valley, California. She's run her own yoga and wellness studios, founded a nonprofit organization, and worked in real estate finance. She's a voracious reader and excels at thinking out of the box and identifying the best of many possible solutions. Welcome, Elize, Doc Elize.
We are going to go. Hi, I'm going to talk about Lyme disease. I'm sure that most of you have heard about it, but what exactly is it? Well, hold on. It is the fastest growing infectious bacterial disease probably in the world, not just in the US. And there are more than 100 species of the pathogen Borrelia, and in the US alone, and 300 worldwide. In fact, Lyme is more common than AIDS, 6 times more common than AIDS, and 300,000 people a year are infected according to the CDC, although they say that that's probably an underestimate. Willy Bergdorfer was the scientist from the CDC whose name is bestowed to the spirochete that is Lyme disease. He was sent to Old Lyme, Connecticut to investigate outbreak of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and discovered that the pathogen that was involved was indeed Lyme disease. And I mentioned this slide. This slide is here not for political reasons, but because I developed Lyme disease when I was 7 or 8 years old. I was diagnosed when I was 47. So my body had been completely ravaged by that time. But throughout my life, I was told that it was all in my head. I couldn't manage stress. I was too aggressive. I was too this, I was too that, and not enough of this or not enough of that. But I was never okay. And in the book written by Nelson Melville, he's an attorney who spent 10 years researching Plum Island, which is an animal disease center off the coast of Long Island. And it is run by Homeland Security. And Lyme disease was one of the pathogens that was studied there. And the thing is, in the book, he describes how the flight path between Plum Island was one of the resting stops for Canada geese. I'm Canadian. And the next stop from there was Lunenburg County, County, Nova Scotia, where I spent my summers, where my grandfather had a farm, and where I'd come in covered in ticks, as did my 7 siblings. My whole family has Lyme disease in one of its manifestations. And in fact, as you'll hear, my father probably died from one of the consequences of it undiagnosed. But what is Lyme disease? It's actually called the new great imitator because, like syphilis, which was the first great imitator, it attacks multiple organ systems and mimics many diseases. It is actually caused by a spirochete-like bacterium that acts like a corkscrew in the body, traveling primarily through fascial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, cartilage, tendons, by preference. But it's not just that. What I'm will be explaining in the first 15 minutes or so is the complexity of the disease, which is why I chose the treatment modalities I did. It has multiple forms like a parasite. It has a cyst form, a coccoid form, and You can see on the left-hand side the little red circles attached to the spirochete are what are called blebs, and they detach from the spirochete and contain all the genetic information to start another infection elsewhere in the body. So it has many, I'm hoping I can get this going here. I have a little video that shows the spirochetes moving in and out of the red blood cells, but I'm not sure how that goes on. So excuse me, we'll do that another time. It's sort of frightening, though. There's also an L form of the pathogen. In other words, there's at least 5 forms we know of, and therefore you have to use different approaches to eliminate the different forms. In conventional thinking, Lyme is divided into 3 sections or 3 categories. Early is when you've just gotten the disease and you actually get a rash, so it can be identified and hopefully very aggressively treated with antibiotics for at least 3 months. And that's would be my minimum. And given the nature of the disease, you'd want to do anything to prevent the dissemination of the spirochete throughout the body. And although I hate antibiotics and I know what it does to the gut, I feel the gut can be repaired more easily than the whole body can once it disseminates. The second stage is early dissemination, but it's not complicated by prior treatment or use of steroids. And it usually involves multiple systems. And the third stage, which is where I was found when I was finally diagnosed, my body had been completely torn apart by that point. Every system of my body was involved. Nothing was working. From my brain to my urinary tract to my reproductives, there's not a single organ system in my body that has not been attacked by this pathogen. And even then, I was still told it was all in my head. The problem with treating Lyme's is that Lyme disease, by the way, it's not Lyme's, it is Lyme disease, is that when the spirochetes die, they release a poison. But it's not just when they die that this endotoxin is released. This nerve poison is released continuously as a mechanism of action to protect itself and create a terrain that's hospitable for its survival. And the disease is not an emerging disease like we hear. It was found in this Iceman mummy, Otzi, who was discovered in the Italian Alps more than 20 years ago. He was ridden with Lyme spirochetes, and he suffered arthritis and cardiovascular disease, and interestingly enough, gallstones. Many people who get treated for Lyme probably, I don't know what the statistic is, maybe 10%, maybe 20% end up with gallbladder problems. But this disease is a pandemic, according to the definition of the National Institutes of Health. It meets all the 8 characteristics of a pandemic. It is here. It's everywhere. It's on every single continent of the world, of the Earth, except Antarctica. It is in every state. What I'm getting at here is it's endemic to everybody, to everything. There are various different forms of ticks that are carriers of diseases such as Lyme and other tick-borne diseases, and they can be found in every state. So don't believe that there's just endemic areas and not endemic areas. Furthermore, don't people travel? And do you live where you were born? And how many times did you move? You could very easily have gone to and lived in many endemic areas, but the fact is right now, all areas are endemic. All areas of the world are endemic. In fact, my assistant in putting together this presentation discovered that there's a Lyme clinic treatment center in Indonesia. In fact, in Canada, where I'm from, 80% of the population will live in an endemic area by 2020 due to climate change, as ticks and other arthropods and organisms are expanding their territory because the climate has changed. But there are many, and so how do you get the spirochete in you? Traditionally, one thinks that it's a tick that carries the spirochete. We wish that were so, except that there's a tick called the baby tick, the nymph, that's the size of a period at the end of a sentence. And it can transmit just as easily as the big tick that you see in, swelled up attached to your dog. So there are, these are the vectors that actually bite you and convey the disease. 1 in 3 of the ticks in the northeastern states carry Lyme disease in their gut. And in fact, doctors' data, a lab in the Midwest, discovered 118 different organisms in the gut of a tick, most of which are unidentified. But it's not just ticks. We wish it were just ticks now. It's mosquitoes, it's flies, spiders, fleas, mites, bees, mites, as I said, sandflies, anything that bites you and draws blood and infects you via the bloodstream, horseflies. And then they're carriers of these vectors, which are cats, dogs, mice, deer, and, beg pardon? And primarily birds. Birds have spread the Lyme spirochete all over the world as they've transported ticks all over the world. In fact, 57 of 100 birds in Northern California that carried ticks had Lyme disease. And interestingly enough, it was a European species, which makes, therefore, diagnosis particularly difficult. If there are 100 species, but we only get tested for 2, 3, and then you're told you don't have Lyme disease. What about the other 98 that you didn't get tested for? What about the other 300 that you might have picked up when you were in Europe? In fact, I might have picked it up. In fact, I probably picked it up at my grandfather's, but I lived in Europe for 2 years on and off, and I was definitely in an endemic area in Europe. And I happened, when I was diagnosed, to get a European strain. Western gray squirrels carry it, excuse the spelling mistake. Hornets and wasps can carry the nymph, for example. And the disease is traditionally diagnosed via what is called an bullseye rash. The problem, however, is that the rash resulting from the bite occurs in, at the most, 40 to 60% of cases, and only 10% of them look like a bullseye. So many of these other rashes that you see in the picture could be Lyme disease. And if it's treated in the early stage, it is very treatable. But it's also transmitted in many other ways. It's the new sexually transmitted disease. You can definitely get it from your partner. It is congenitally transferred. I transferred Lyme disease. I was undiagnosed when I birthed my 3 children. They all have Lyme disease. One of them's a complete silent carrier. My son, youngest son at 14 wasn't expected to live because of hypercoagulation of his blood caused by Lyme disease and other things. So the mother passes it through to her children transplacentally, plus through breast milk. I remember crying when my youngest pushed me away. He didn't want any more breast milk at 7 months. And thank God he didn't want any more, because I was limed out like crazy at the time. I had no memory. I could barely talk. I was talking in half sentences. I was immensely fatigued and just thought it was postpartum. I had 3 children in 3 years and 4 months, so I figured I had a right to be fatigued. You can also get Lyme from organ donors. In fact, in 2013, 3 fatal cases of Lyme carditis were reported to the CDC. All 3 were organ donors, and before it was identified, corneas were transplanted into 3 recipients. The eye is actually one of a great host, a great reservoir of Lyme disease, so that's particularly dangerous, and likely that those people would end up with Lyme disease. Lyme disease can also be gotten via transfusion because our blood supply is not cleaned of the various forms of Lyme, and even the process that is supposed to sterilize our blood products. The spirochete, in this case, the Miyamotoi, which is common to this area, survived. So there are many forms of transition. The reason I'm telling you all this is it's a very tricky disease. It's a very adaptable organism. 40% of patients with Lyme disease end up with long-term health problems, and I think that's probably low because they don't recognize that the next problem they get 2 years later is actually also Lyme disease or caused by it, as well as a short-term people treated with antibiotics relapse usually 40% of the time. I interviewed a doctor in the Czech Republic who swore that he was curing Lyme disease, and that's why I interviewed him. I wanted to know how the hell was he curing Lyme disease? Well, I discovered that he admitted like a year or two later they'd come back with another sign of Lyme disease and they'd get more doses of antibiotics, and then they'd do it again and again, and by the end of the interview I'm going, I thought you said you were curing Lyme disease, and he did not know what to say. But what is Lyme disease? Why is it so difficult to cure? Because it's actually multiple diseases. Multiple systemic infectious disease syndrome is what it's now being called. Because you can see in the top left-hand corner the Borrelia corkscrew spirochete, but then there's also Babesia, these are the other organisms transferred via the vectors include, and what they do, they suppress the immune system, they cause more inflammation, they cause oxidative stress, they destabilize metabolism, they complicate the matter so intensely that you can't tell what infection is causing what. And most of the practitioners I know just throw one form of antibiotic after another, and sometimes in series, sometimes grouped, hoping that they'll knock it out. These are other co-infections, in other words, those infections transferred by the same vector. Rickettsia, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And then there are the opportunistic infections. Once the immune system is depressed from Lyme disease, and I'll get into that in a minute, then there's the other viruses and bacterium and parasites that hop on board and say, hey, look, the terrain is great, let's have a feast. Babesia is another infection associated with Lyme disease, and I have this one here that it was discovered in Spain. We're finding Bartonella all over the world. Many of these co-infections now can be found in every continent, but they have to be looked for. As an example, the spirochete syphilis, which is the same family of bacterium as Lyme disease, is visualized through a dark field microscope. And for some reason, Lyme isn't. But many of these diseases you have to think about them to identify them, because they need to be identified in ways other than traditional labs are used to identifying pathogens. Ehrlichiosis is another co-infection that can be deadly. You might have heard of Morgellons, which is a very freaky disease. People feel like they are exuding wires, and lots of stuff comes out of their skin, but 95% of them have been shown to have Lyme disease. And what they're exuding, in my opinion, is all the toxins. Tularemia is another one. It's a bacterial parasite. Anaplasmosis is a potentially fatal disease that is common with Lyme disease. So you're not just treating Lyme. And mycoplasma is a 1,000 times smaller than most bacterium and lives in the red blood cell. It's a cell membrane disease, and it is resistant to antibiotics, as are many of these other diseases I mentioned. But you could have a multitude of these diseases. You could have 6 of them, 8 of them, 10 of them, and not know it. So the symptoms of Lyme disease, consequently, because you're dealing with a lot of organisms, and you're dealing with a spirochete that attacks all organisms, all organs, and all organ systems. The symptoms vary tremendously, but most crazy-making is that they migrate. One day you think you're fine, the next day you're lying on your back flat, you can't move. I've spent about 6 years, maybe 3 years in bed and 6 to 8 years homebound in my life, when I would just do a lot of studying. So the migrating symptoms are very crazy-making, and which is one of the reasons it is such a difficult disease to diagnose, but that is actually one of its primary principles, one of its distinguishing characteristics is its migrating nature. So symptoms can be neurological of all sort, whether they be, I used to have hyperreflexes like an Olympian athlete. Then on other times, I would be so slow to react that I'd fall. I have had seizures while doing Qigong. I've had Bell's palsy, facial paralysis, headaches I suffered for 10 years, and they were mind-blowing, stare at the wall for days on end headaches. But there was nothing wrong with me. There's all sorts of metabolic problems, of course. Sleep apnea. There are neuropsychological problems, head problems. I want to just point out the pinna of my ears hurt so much for a week or on 2 occasions that if I hit my ear, my knees gave out. I would just go down. That's how painful the ear was. You can lose your throat, your voice overnight. I was deaf in my late teens, and I would go blind occasionally. And there are, in fact, 113 different eye diseases that can be attributable to Lyme disease. Respiratory problems, urinary problems, cardiovascular problems, and I want to mention heart block. That's how I think my father died. He died of ventricular block, and that is now discovered to be typical of Lyme disease. And I was rushed to the hospital so many times for heart problems that I was kicked out of my doctor's practice, because by the time I got there, there would be nothing wrong with me, they thought. Skin problems, abdominal problems, the gut problems, reproductive problems, and pregnancy problems, including infertility, miscarriage, stillbirths, and premature births. And obviously, what Lyme is known for is musculoskeletal problems, the arthralgias, the arthritis, the body pain, the fibromyalgia-like symptoms. In fact, 40% of people relapse after antibiotics and 40% can't work, which, by the way, in Canada means if 80% of the population is an endemic area and 40% can't work, this is a problem. The EMBER study actually that was never published, showed that antibiotics indeed didn't work. The traditional 28 days of antibiotics left 100% of the primates in the study with Borrelia, the spirochete. So it's a persistent disease, and there are 700 peer-reviewed journals that show that it is a persistent disease that antibiotics do not work on, especially the early dissemination and the late dissemination. It is a disease of misdiagnoses. There's actually 50 diseases I could have written there, but the ones I'm focusing on are Alzheimer's. 70% of the brains from the CDC tissue lab for brain were found to have spirochetes in one study, and then in another study, 100%. Multiple sclerosis, likewise. Lyme can be the triggering factor. I have a brother with severe multiple sclerosis. And mold poisoning, another biotoxin illness, can look like Lyme disease. It is a stealth pathogen, and that's why I chose to use the modalities of healing that I did. It's immunosuppressive. It uses many mechanisms to disable the immune system. It's multisystemic. It's a biofilm disease. It's a stealth pathogen in that it varies its form, just like a parasite, and it travels through the tissues versus the blood, so it's hard to find in the blood and therefore to diagnose. It can go undetected for decades while it passes throughout all of your body systems to the point where under stress, you then experience a very serious disease. And it also eats manganese instead of iron, like most of the bacterium, and therefore it eludes the immune system more easily, and it's not in competition with other organisms in your body for the iron. It releases, as I said, a poison, a biotoxin, a nerve poison, just like the mold Aspergillus, and so it's chronically poisoning you. It is also cell wall deficient, so it can't be seen. And it resides in biofilms, which are like cocoons that protect it, and these biofilms can be found anywhere in the body. And it has an extremely long reproductive cycle for a bacterium, 28 to 30 days, and it's been clinically observed to coincide with the full moon. Sounds like a parasite. And Dr. Brian Fallon from Columbia University has found it in brains in a big way. So if your brain's not working and it's throughout your systems, how do you go after it? Well, obviously antibiotics I knew wasn't going to work in the long term for this disease because I had it chronically. In fact, my Lyme literate doctor said there are no medicines for people as sick as you, and sent me home to die in 2006. And I didn't die, I changed my terrain. And I think people here, a lot of you know what that means. By manipulating the human bioterrain, I was able to make my body an inhospitable host for the pathogens that were destroying it, that had destroyed it. And then I actually had to rebuild it. I wanted to reestablish physiological equilibrium, but one that was stable but labile, that could flow with stress. And I needed to manipulate my personal environment, which was very important in order to get a clean space. I nourished my body. I won't go into the foods because there's so many people who talk about food, but I definitely did use food as medicine and used lots of superfoods. Avoiding sugar was critical. It causes inflammation, and it feeds Lyme, yeast, cancer, parasites, and most of the other organisms that you probably carry if you carry Lyme disease. So avoiding sugar. Interestingly enough, stevia, the sugar substitute, was proven to be more effective at reducing Lyme pathogens than doxycycline, and this was by a very renowned Lyme researcher, Dr. Eva Stapi. I applied the principles of biobiology when I said I had to change my environment, my personal environment. That's the first thing I start with my clients. You have to get out of the stress of electromagnetic radiation. You have to get out of the poisons, remove the poisons in your environment, the personal care products, the cleaners, the furniture, the bedding that is poisoning you. And you have to secure super revitalized water as well as very clean air. So I created a health-enhancing living space for myself. It's very, very important to do so in your bedroom because that's when your body gets to rest and restore itself. It doesn't get to do it if it's subjected to electromagnetic radiation, which is what this netting is for. I also paid attention to blacking out the room and using all organics. I got new beds. And in fact, I found that I had slept on the opposite side of the wall of my house's electrical panel. And for 10 years, I had been in a massive electromagnetic field, which no doubt seriously contributed to my demise. So I reduced all this static electricity. I opened windows. I changed materials in my home. I got rid of carpets. I used Stetzer filters to remove dirty electricity from my home. And I added natural light and opened windows, and I made sure I walked every morning at 9 o'clock with no sunglasses on to reset my circadian rhythms and for the exercise I needed to rebuild myself. I obviously had to reduce my pathogen load, but my focus was not microbe-centric, but terrain-centric. It just so happened that there were too many microbes there. So instead of using your gut-disturbing antibiotics, I used essential oils, herbs, and a lot of homeopathy, which I forgot to mention here. Homeopathy was very important. I reduced the endotoxin load and the exotoxin load, the endotoxin load being caused by the pathogens in my body and normal body metabolism. And the exotoxin load was all the crap from the environment that needed to go. And I found that I harbored, even though I'd been on an organic diet, I'd had yoga studios, I drank filtered water, I harbored toxins galore because of Lyme disease. Lyme disease, in everyone I've ever met with it, messes up your lymphatic system. That's your immune system and your detox system, or one of them. And so there were a lot of lymphatic treatments that had to be done in order to replenish the body, to detox the body. Thermal therapies and ozone treatments were also very important. Thermal therapies for rebooting heat in your body. Everyone with Lyme disease and almost everyone with chronic diseases has low voltage and very low body temperature, abnormally low body temperature. You will never get better unless you raise your basal body temperature. So there were a lot of heat therapies. I did myofascial release work to deal with the extensive scarring in my body. My whole body was a mass of scars, and I walked and moved like an old lady for years because the spirochetes had scarred all my fascial tissue, ligaments, and tendons, particularly in my chest. For a long time, for years, it took courage to breathe because it was so painful for my ribs to expand. And so I ended up breathing way up in my chest. Very importantly, I worked on electromagnetic medicine. I increased my chi, which had been totally destroyed. And we are electromagnetic beings. My time is up, so I'm going to go through, just mention a few things. Voltage equals health. You want high voltage. And so I actually had a Qigong master who saved my life after I had had, I don't know, my 8th or 10th or 12th cardiac event. I ended up going to a Qigong master every day for a year, of which I spent first 6 months doing hands-on Qigong, which was a terrible, painful experience, actually. And then I had to learn my own practice. I had to figure out how to get rid of all the unnecessary electromagnetic frequencies around me in order to use the healthy ones in order to heal. And there are many mechanisms of action that are scientifically proven in terms of using electromagnetic energy to heal. And I won't go into them, but both conventional medicine using modern machines like a frequency-specific microcurrent, which is what I used, and which is an FDA Class 2 medical device used like a rife machine. We can increase our chi in multiple ways, and the benefits are there. Can you read them fast enough? And there are a zillion ways, a zillion modalities, many, many modalities to increase your chi, and I pretty much tried them all. And I became a practitioner. I'm a Qigong master, actually, and I became a practitioner of many of the ways that I use to heal myself, because these are the ways I use to heal other people, including, and very, very importantly, far infrared saunas. And that's all I have time for.
Great, thank you very much.